The morning sun cast long shadows across LaGuardia Airport's bustling Terminal B as Captain David Thompson adjusted his pilot's uniform one last time before heading through security. At 45, he carried himself with quiet confidence, earned from countless hours in the cockpit and a distinguished career that spoke for itself. As he walked through the terminal, rolling his flight bag behind him, he couldn't help but notice the usual mix of reactions. Some passengers did double takes, others whispered to their companions, and a few even pulled out their phones to snap quick pictures. Being one of the few black commercial airline pilots in the industry, he'd grown used to standing out. The terminal buzzed with early morning energy. Business travelers clutching their coffee cups, families carolling excited children, and airport staff efficiently going about their duties. David checked his watch, 6:45 a.m., right on schedule for the morning flight to Chicago. At the crew entrance, he greeted Tommy, the security guard who'd been checking IDs for over 2 decades. "Morning, Captain. Beautiful day for flying." Tommy's genuine smile was always a bright start to any morning shift. They chatted briefly about the weather forecast, clear skies all the way to Chicago, perfect flying conditions. In the crew room, David methodically went through his pre-flight routine. He'd developed these habits during his time in the Air Force, and they'd served him well in commercial aviation. He pulled out his iPad, checking the flight plan, weather updates, and passenger manifest for the 100th time. Flight 2317 to Chicago O'Hare, 183 passengers, departure time 7:45 a.m. As he reviewed the documentation, his co-pilot Mike Chen walked in, bringing with him the aroma of fresh coffee. "Got your usual," Captain Mike said, placing a cup of black coffee on the table. They'd been flying together for 3 years now, and Mike knew David's pre-flight preferences by heart. The two pilots discussed the flight plan, noting the slight turbulence expected over Pennsylvania due to a weather system moving through. David liked how Mike always came prepared, having already studied the route and potential challenges. Their professional chemistry had made them one of the airline's most reliable crews. Walking through the terminal toward their gate, David noticed a group of schoolchildren on what appeared to be their first airport visit. Their teacher was explaining how planes fly, and several kids pointed excitedly at David's uniform. He smiled warmly and gave them a friendly wave, remembering how his own love for aviation started with a similar school trip decades ago. At Gate B7, the morning crew was already preparing for boarding. Lisa, the lead flight attendant, greeted them with her characteristic enthusiasm. "Morning, Captain. We've got a full flight today." She quickly briefed them on the passenger list, including a couple celebrating their 50th anniversary and a youth basketball team heading to a tournament. As David completed his exterior walk-around inspection of the aircraft, his fingers running along the smooth metal surface checking for any abnormalities, he reflected on his journey. From the small boy who dreamed of flying while watching planes from his grandmother's backyard, to the Air Force Academy, to now commanding this massive commercial airliner, every step had been a testament to perseverance. The rising sun glinted off the aircraft's polished exterior as David completed his inspection. Everything was in perfect order, just as he liked it. Back inside, he settled into the cockpit, his second home. The familiar array of instruments and controls surrounded him like old friends. He began the pre-flight checklist, his voice clear and professional as he and Mike went through each item methodically. Through the cockpit window, he could see the first passengers beginning to gather at the gate. Some looked tired, others anxious, a few excited. David knew that each person boarding his plane was putting their trust in him, and he took that responsibility seriously. As he always told new pilots he mentored, "In this job, we're not just flying planes. We're carrying people's lives, their stories, their dreams." Little did he know that this routine morning flight was about to become anything but ordinary, and his professional skills would be tested in ways he never expected. But for now, in these quiet moments before boarding began, Captain David Thompson was simply doing what he loved most, preparing to take to the skies, ready to prove once again that excellence knows no color. The boarding process was about to begin at Gate B7 when Mr. Wilson, a well-dressed man in his 70s, approached the counter. He carried himself with the kind of authority that came from decades of getting his own way, his expensive leather briefcase swinging with each deliberate step. "I need to speak to someone in charge," he announced, loud enough for nearby passengers to look up from their phones. The gate agent, Patricia, gave him her professional smile. "How can I help you today, sir?" Mr. Wilson leaned forward, his knuckles turning white as he gripped the counter. There must be some mistake. "I just saw who's supposed to be flying this plane." His voice carried across the waiting area, drawing more attention. "I've been flying first class for 40 years, and I've never seen—" He paused, his next words dripping with disdain, "someone like him in the cockpit." A hush fell over the gate area. Several passengers lowered their newspapers, while others pretended not to listen while clearly hanging on every word. A young woman in the front row quietly began recording with her phone. Patricia maintained her composure, though her smile tightened slightly. "Sir, Captain Thompson is one of our most experienced pilots, with an outstanding record of—" "Experienced?" Mr. Wilson scoffed, cutting her off. "I want to see his credentials, right now, and I want to speak to the actual captain." He emphasized the word actual while glancing meaningfully at a white pilot walking past the gate. The murmuring among the waiting passengers grew louder. A businessman in a charcoal suit shook his head in disapproval. A mother covered her children's ears, while an elderly woman clutched her pearls, though whether from agreement or shock at Mr. Wilson's behavior wasn't clear. That's when Captain Thompson emerged from the jet bridge, his footsteps measured and calm. He'd heard enough to understand the situation. 20 years of flying had taught him that moments like these were opportunities, not obstacles. "Good morning, sir," he said, his voice carrying the kind of quiet authority that made people naturally want to listen. "I couldn't help but overhear your concerns. I'm Captain Thompson." He extended his hand, not as a challenge, but as an invitation. Mr. Wilson stared at the offered hand, then at the 4 stripes on Captain Thompson's sleeve, his face reddening. "This is ridiculous. I demand to see your qualifications. My ticket cost thousands of dollars, and I have a right to ensure this flight is in capable hands." Several passengers shifted uncomfortably. A teenager whispered, "Is this for real?" to his mother. The young woman with the phone kept recording, her hand trembling slightly with anger. Captain Thompson maintained his professional demeanor, reaching slowly into his flight bag. He pulled out a leather folder and opened it carefully. "I understand your concern for safety, sir. Here are my credentials. 12 years in the Air Force, where I flew everything from cargo planes to fighter jets. 15 years with commercial airlines, over 15,000 flight hours, and an incident-free record. I've also trained other pilots and written safety protocols for the airline." The terminal had grown so quiet you could hear the distant roar of jets taking off. Mr. Wilson's face cycled through various shades of red as he scanned the documents, looking for any flaw he could find. A slow clap started somewhere in the back of the waiting area. Others joined in, and soon most of the gate area was applauding. An older veteran in a faded military cap stood up and saluted. The young woman who'd been recording called out, "That's our pilot." Mr. Wilson found himself increasingly isolated as other first-class passengers deliberately moved away from him. A distinguished-looking woman in a business suit loudly announced, "I feel safer already, knowing we have such an experienced captain." But Captain Thompson raised his hand gently, quieting the impromptu show of support. "Thank you, everyone, but there's no need for that. Mr. Wilson's safety concerns are important to me, as is the safety of every passenger on this aircraft. Now, sir," he turned back to the increasingly uncomfortable Mr. Wilson, "would you like to discuss any specific technical questions about today's flight? I'm happy to address any concerns about our route, weather conditions, or aircraft systems." The professional courtesy in the face of blatant prejudice made Mr. Wilson's position increasingly untenable. He mumbled something inaudible and retreated to a corner of the waiting area, suddenly very interested in his phone. Captain Thompson turned to Patricia. "Let's begin boarding in 5 minutes. I need to complete my final pre-flight checks." As he walked back toward the aircraft, several passengers nodded respectfully. A young black girl tugged her father's sleeve and whispered excitedly, "Dad, I want to be a pilot too." Little did anyone know that this confrontation was just the beginning of a flight that would change perspectives and possibly save a life. As the boarding process began, Mr. Wilson sat alone, unaware that his worst prejudices would soon be challenged in the most unexpected way. The airplane cabin hummed with nervous energy as passengers settled into their seats. Captain Thompson stood in the cockpit, preparing for takeoff, while his co-pilot Mike handled the final system checks. Through the cabin video feed, he could see Mr. Wilson shifting uncomfortably in his first-class seat, deliberately avoiding eye contact with the flight attendants. Captain Thompson picked up the intercom microphone, his voice warm and professional as it filled the cabin. "Good morning, everyone. This is your captain speaking. We're looking at clear skies to Chicago today, with an expected flight time of 2 hours and 15 minutes. The temperature at O'Hare is a pleasant 72 degrees. He paused briefly, then continued, "You know, someone once told me that every flight is a chance to bring people together. Today, we're carrying 183 different stories, business people heading to important meetings, families going on adventures, and even a youth basketball team chasing their dreams. Thank you for choosing to be part of our journey." The simple humanity in his words resonated through the cabin. A few passengers nodded appreciatively, while others smiled. Even some of those who'd seemed uncertain earlier began to relax. In the terminal, videos of the earlier confrontation were already spreading across social media. The young woman who'd recorded it had added a caption, "Watch how this amazing pilot handles pure disrespect with absolute class. #respect, #professionalism." Back in the cockpit, Mike turned to his captain. "That was quite a situation back there. I've never seen anyone handle it so smoothly." Captain Thompson adjusted a few settings on the control panel. "You know, Mike, in 20 years of flying, I've learned that anger just adds weight to the aircraft. Can't fly as high with it." He smiled slightly, checking the weather radar one more time. The next hour passed smoothly as they cruised at 36,000 feet. Flight attendants served drinks and snacks, the basketball team chatted excitedly about their upcoming tournament, and Mr. Wilson remained unusually quiet, staring out his window at the clouds below. During the drink service, a retired Air Force colonel in business class asked to pass a note to the cockpit. The note read, "Captain, I served for 30 years. Never saw such dignity under fire. You remind me of the best commanders I knew. It's an honor to fly with you today." The flight attendants had their own way of showing support. When serving Mr. Wilson, they remained impeccably professional, perhaps a bit too professional, their courtesy so perfect it became almost pointed. Other passengers occasionally glanced his way, some with disapproval, others with pity. A young boy, maybe 7 years old, walked past Mr. Wilson's seat on his way to the bathroom. He stopped briefly, looking at the older man with that direct curiosity only children possess. "My mom says you were mean to our pilot," he said simply, "but he's still taking you to Chicago." Before anyone could respond, he continued to the bathroom, leaving Mr. Wilson to absorb the pure, unfiltered truth of a child's observation. Halfway through the flight, Captain Thompson's voice came over the intercom again, pointing out the Great Lakes visible on the right side of the aircraft. His extensive knowledge and evident passion for flying shone through as he shared interesting facts about the landmarks below. Several passengers pulled out their phones, recording the view while capturing his commentary. One posted a video with the caption, "This is the pilot from that viral video. Listen to how much he loves his job. Don't let anyone dim your light. #excellence." In first class, Mr. Wilson watched as other passengers enthusiastically looked out their windows, following the captain's guidance to spot various landmarks. He found himself listening despite his earlier behavior, caught up in the infectious enthusiasm of the moment. The flight attendants noticed a subtle shift in the cabin's atmosphere. What had started as tension had transformed into something else, a shared experience that was somehow larger than the morning's conflict. Passengers who had been strangers an hour ago were now pointing out sights to each other, sharing a moment of wonder at the view from 36,000 feet. As they crossed over Michigan, Captain Thompson's steady hand guided the aircraft through a small patch of turbulence so smoothly that most passengers barely noticed. Each movement of the controls reflected years of experience, each decision backed by thousands of hours in the sky. Little did anyone know that this harmonious moment was about to be dramatically interrupted. Mr. Wilson's face was beginning to show signs of distress, though he attributed his discomfort to the tension of the morning. In just a few minutes, everyone on board would discover that true character reveals itself not in moments of comfort, but in times of crisis. The peaceful flight took a sudden turn when Mr. Wilson began clutching his chest. His breathing became labored, and sweat beaded on his forehead. At first, he tried to hide his discomfort, pride still holding him back from asking for help. The flight attendant walking past noticed something wasn't right. "Sir, are you feeling okay?" she asked, concerned by his pale complexion. Mr. Wilson tried to wave her off, but the pain was becoming unbearable. "I'm fine," he insisted through gritted teeth. Just some heartburn." But his shaking hands and ashen face told a different story. The businessman sitting next to him noticed the situation and pressed his call button urgently. Within moments, the head flight attendant was at his side. "Ladies and gentlemen," her voice came over the intercom, "is there a doctor or medical professional on board?" The cabin fell silent. Passengers looked around, hoping someone would stand up. The basketball team's coach knew CPR, but this seemed beyond his expertise. A retired nurse 3 rows back made her way forward, but she hadn't practiced in years. In the cockpit, Captain Thompson received the alert about the medical emergency. The patient's identity made no difference. His training kicked in immediately. He quickly assessed their position, 35,000 feet up, halfway between Detroit and Chicago. "Mike, take control," he instructed his co-pilot. "I need to check the situation." In all his years of flying, he'd handled various emergencies, but each one required quick thinking and calm decisions. The flight attendants had moved Mr. Wilson to a clearer area near the galley. His tie was loosened, but his breathing was getting worse. The retired nurse checked his pulse, rapid and irregular. "He's showing classic heart attack symptoms," she reported. Captain Thompson knelt beside Mr. Wilson, their earlier confrontation forgotten. "Sir, I'm going to help you. Try to stay calm." He turned to the flight attendant. "Get the emergency medical kit and AED. Now." Mr. Wilson's eyes, filled with fear, met the captain's. Gone was the arrogance from earlier, replaced by raw vulnerability. I don't want to die," he whispered. "Not on my aircraft, sir," Captain Thompson replied firmly. "Not on my watch." He began coordinating with the ground through the aircraft's medical communication system, relaying vital signs and symptoms. Passengers watched in tense silence. The young woman who'd recorded the earlier confrontation had put her phone away, now holding hands with a stranger next to her, both praying quietly. The nearest airport was still 20 minutes away. Every minute mattered. The retired nurse monitored Mr. Wilson's condition while Captain Thompson made rapid calculations. Fuel load, weather conditions, emergency landing protocols, all these factors raced through his mind. Back in the cockpit, he had to make a critical decision. The closest airport was a smaller regional one, while O'Hare, with its better medical facilities, was further away. Time versus resources, a decision that could mean life or death. "Chicago Center, this is Flight 2317 declaring a medical emergency," he announced into his radio, his voice steady and clear. "Requesting priority clearance for emergency landing." The basketball team coach organized his players to help secure loose items. A pharmaceutical salesman offered aspirin from his bag. Complete strangers became a team, all focused on keeping one man alive. Mr. Wilson drifted in and out of consciousness. In his moments of clarity, he looked at Captain Thompson with eyes that spoke volumes. The same man he insulted hours ago was now fighting to save his life. The turbulence started, a storm system they'd have normally gone around. But today, time was precious. Captain Thompson's hands stayed steady on the controls, each movement precise and calculated. They'd have to go through it, not around it. As the plane began its emergency descent, the entire cabin held its breath. Nobody cared about missed connections or delayed meetings anymore. One passenger's phone quietly recorded the scene, not for social media this time, but to preserve a moment when humanity rose above prejudice. The next few minutes would test everyone on board, especially Captain Thompson. But as he guided the massive aircraft through rough air, one thought kept him focused. Everyone on this plane, regardless of their beliefs or behaviors, deserved his absolute best. Captain Thompson's voice remained steady as he guided the aircraft through layers of clouds. The regional airport had already cleared all other traffic, their runway waiting. Every second counted now, as Mr. Wilson's condition continued to worsen in the cabin. "Cabin crew, prepare for immediate landing," he announced, his calm tone helping keep passengers focused rather than panicked. The flight attendants moved with practiced efficiency, checking seat belts and securing loose items. The retired nurse stayed by Mr. Wilson's side, holding his hand. "Stay with us, sir," she encouraged, watching his breathing grow more labored. The AED remained nearby, though they all prayed it wouldn't be needed. Through the cockpit window, the runway appeared through breaks in the clouds. Captain Thompson had landed at this airport only twice before, both times in perfect weather. Today's conditions were far from perfect. Gusty crosswinds and poor visibility made this emergency landing even more challenging. "Flaps 30, he commanded, his co-pilot responding instantly. The aircraft descended through turbulent air, but Thompson's hands remained steady on the controls. Years of military flying had taught him how to handle pressure. Today, those lessons would save a life. In the cabin, passengers gripped their armrests. The basketball team coach led his players in a quiet prayer. A young mother held her child close, whispering reassuring words. The cabin felt like a single organism, every person connected by shared concern for the man who, just hours ago, had caused such controversy. 1,000 feet, the automated system announced. Captain Thompson could see emergency vehicles already positioned along the runway, their lights flashing through the rain. He practiced emergency landings hundreds of times in simulators, but this was different. This was real. The aircraft bucked in the turbulent air. Lesser pilots might have diverted to a larger airport with better weather, but Thompson knew time was the enemy now. Mr. Wilson needed immediate medical attention. 500 feet, the system continued its countdown. Thompson felt the crosswind trying to push them off course, but his corrections were immediate and precise. The runway grew larger in his view. The landing gear deployed with a reassuring thud. In the cabin, Mr. Wilson had fallen unconscious, the retired nurse now counting his pulse aloud, her voice shaking but determined. 300 feet. Rain pelted the windscreen. Thompson's focus narrowed to the runway ahead, his whole world becoming about putting this aircraft down safely. Behind him, over 100 lives trusted his skill and judgment. 100 feet. The aircraft crossed the runway threshold. Thompson pulled back slightly, positioning for touchdown. This would have to be perfect, no time for a go-around. The wheels touched down with barely a bump, a testament to years of experience. Maximum braking engaged immediately, the aircraft's reverse thrusters roaring as they slowed. Passengers pressed forward against their seatbelts, bags shifted in overhead bins, but everyone remained secure. They rolled to a stop near the waiting emergency vehicles. Captain Thompson's voice came over the intercom one final time. "Cabin crew, doors in emergency mode and cross-brake." 6 months after the emergency landing, the local flight school buzzed with excitement. Mr. Wilson stood at the podium, his voice strong and clear as he addressed the crowd gathered for the launch of the Sky's No Limit Scholarship Program. "Life gives us second chances," he began, glancing at Captain Thompson, who sat in the front row. "Sometimes those chances come at 36,000 feet. A gentle laugh rippled through the audience. The hangar had been transformed for the occasion. 20 young students from diverse backgrounds sat wide-eyed, each holding an acceptance letter to the flight training program. Mr. Wilson had not only funded their training, but had also become the program's most passionate advocate. "When I boarded that flight 6 months ago," he continued, his voice catching slightly, "I was a different person. I carried prejudices I didn't even realize I had. It took nearly dying to make me see how wrong I was." Phones recorded his speech, but this time, the purpose wasn't to capture controversy. This was about documenting change, about showing how one moment could transform not just a life, but an entire community. In the audience, the young woman who'd recorded the original confrontation wiped away tears. Her video had sparked a conversation, but what happened next had sparked a movement. Mr. Wilson gestured to the flight simulator installed in the corner. "Each of these students will have access to top-tier training equipment. They'll learn from the best instructors." He paused, looking at Captain Thompson, "and they'll learn that excellence knows no bounds." The retired nurse from the flight sat nearby, now a regular volunteer at the program's medical screening days. The basketball team coach had spread the word through youth sports networks, bringing in more applicants than they could handle. Captain Thompson took the podium next. "When I started flying," he said, "I didn't see many pilots who looked like me. Today, we're changing that story." He turned to the students. "The sky belongs to all of us." A local business owner stood up, announcing additional funding for more scholarships. Then another joined in. The movement was growing beyond what either man had imagined. Mr. Wilson's granddaughter, now training in the program, demonstrated the simulator for visitors. Her hands moved confidently over the controls as she explained the basics of flight to wide-eyed children. The story had made national news, not for the controversy, but for what came after. Other airlines started similar programs. Old barriers began falling, not through force, but through understanding and opportunity. As the event wound down, Mr. Wilson and Captain Thompson stood by the hangar door, watching planes take off in the distance. "You know," Mr. Wilson said, "I used to think I was successful because of what I earned. Now I realize true success is about what you change." Captain Thompson nodded. "Every flight is a chance to rise above," he replied, watching a plane climb into the evening sky. Behind them, the next class of student pilots practiced their radio calls, their voices carrying the sound of future change. The walls that had seemed so permanent 6 months ago were proving to be as insubstantial as clouds. A news crew captured the final moment of the day, Mr. Wilson and Captain Thompson helping a young student adjust her headset before her first training flight. The camera caught her smile, the encouraging nods from both men, and the simple truth that had emerged from that fateful flight. Sometimes the greatest journeys aren't about reaching a destination, but about changing the hearts that make the journey. As the first stars appeared above the airfield, they twinkled on a new generation of pilots, rising above old prejudices on wings of change. 3 days after the emergency landing, the local hospital's cardiac unit buzzed with activity. Mr. Wilson lay in his bed, surrounded by beeping monitors and the gentle hum of medical equipment. The doctors had been clear. If the flight hadn't diverted when it did, he likely wouldn't have survived. Through his hospital room window, he could see the airport in the distance, planes taking off and landing in a steady rhythm. Each one reminded him of his own journey, though not just the physical one that had saved his life. The local news had picked up the story. Videos of both the pre-flight confrontation and the emergency landing had spread across the internet. Mr. Wilson's daughter had seen them while booking her flight to the hospital. "Dad," she'd said upon arriving, "what were you thinking?" He wasn't sure how to answer that question. The past few days had given him plenty of time to think, especially during the quiet night hours when the hospital corridors grew still. A knock on the door interrupted his thoughts. A nurse entered, checking his vital signs. "You have a visitor," she announced, "if you're feeling up to it." Mr. Wilson nodded, expecting another family member. Instead, Captain Thompson stood in the doorway, still in his uniform, apparently having just finished another flight. "I hope I'm not interrupting," the captain said quietly. "I wanted to check on you before my next flight." The room fell silent except for the steady beep of the heart monitor. Mr. Wilson's hands fidgeted with his blanket, words failing him for a moment. "My grandson showed me the videos," he finally said, his voice rough with emotion. "All of them. The way I acted at the gate, and then—" He paused, gathering strength, "and then how you saved my life anyway." Captain Thompson pulled up a chair, his movements unhurried. "I was just doing my job, sir." "No," Mr. Wilson shook his head. "You did more than your job. You showed me what real character looks like." His voice cracked slightly. "I've been successful my whole life, thought I knew everything. But I've never been more wrong than I was that day at the airport." The nurse quietly slipped out, leaving them alone. Through the window, another plane took off, its engines roaring briefly before fading into the distance. "You know," Mr. Wilson continued, "I've been lying here thinking about all the pilots I've judged over the years, all the people I've looked down on. I missed out on knowing some probably amazing people because I couldn't see past." He gestured vaguely, ashamed to even say it. Captain Thompson leaned forward. "Mr. Wilson, in my years of flying, I've learned something important. At 36,000 feet, everyone's the same. The sky doesn't care about our differences. Neither do emergencies." A young doctor entered with some test results, then stopped short, recognizing both men from the news. He stood quietly, witnessing a moment that went beyond medical recovery. "My grandkids are coming to visit tomorrow," Mr. Wilson said. "The youngest one, she's 7. She wants to be a pilot now." He smiled weakly. "She saw the video of how you handled everything. Told her mom, that's what a real hero looks like." Captain Thompson smiled. There's a program at the local flight school for young people interested in aviation. All backgrounds welcome. I'd be happy to share the information. Mr. Wilson's eyes welled up. I'd like that. Maybe I could help sponsor some scholarships. Try to add something good to the world instead of. A comfortable silence fell between them. Outside, the afternoon sun caught the wings of another departing plane, making it shine like a promise of better things to come. Before leaving, Captain Thompson left his card on the bedside table. Get well soon, Mr. Wilson. The skies welcome everyone who's ready to see the world from a different perspective. As the captain walked out, Mr. Wilson noticed his grandson had captured part of their conversation on his phone. Later, this video too would spread, but with a different message, one of redemption, growth, and the power of responding to prejudice with excellence and grace. The story wasn't over yet, but already it had touched more lives than either man could have imagined that morning at the gate. Sometimes, the most important journeys aren't measured in miles, but in the distance a heart can travel from hatred to understanding. 6 months after the emergency landing, the local flight school buzzed with excitement. Mr. Wilson stood at the podium, his voice strong and clear as he addressed the crowd gathered for the launch of the Sky's No Limit Scholarship Program. Life gives us second chances, he began, glancing at Captain Thompson, who sat in the front row. Sometimes those chances come at 36,000 feet. A gentle laugh rippled through the audience. The hangar had been transformed for the occasion. 20 young students from diverse backgrounds sat wide-eyed, each holding an acceptance letter to the flight training program. Mr. Wilson had not only funded their training, but had also become the program's most passionate advocate. When I boarded that flight 6 months ago, he continued, his voice catching slightly, I was a different person. I carried prejudices I didn't even realize I had. It took nearly dying to make me see how wrong I was. Phones recorded his speech, but this time, the purpose wasn't to capture controversy. This was about documenting change, about showing how one moment could transform not just a life, but an entire community. In the audience, the young woman who'd recorded the original confrontation wiped away tears. Her video had sparked a conversation, but what happened next had sparked a movement. Mr. Wilson gestured to the flight simulator installed in the corner. Each of these students will have access to top-tier training equipment. They'll learn from the best instructors. He paused, looking at Captain Thompson, and they'll learn that excellence knows no bounds. The retired nurse from the flight sat nearby, now a regular volunteer at the program's medical screening days. The basketball team coach had spread the word through youth sports networks, bringing in more applicants than they could handle. Captain Thompson took the podium next. When I started flying, he said, I didn't see many pilots who looked like me. Today, we're changing that story. He turned to the students. The sky belongs to all of us. A local business owner stood up, announcing additional funding for more scholarships. Then another joined in. The movement was growing beyond what either man had imagined. Mr. Wilson's granddaughter, now training in the program, demonstrated the simulator for visitors. Her hands moved confidently over the controls as she explained the basics of flight to wide-eyed children. The story had made national news, not for the controversy, but for what came after. Other airlines started similar programs. Old barriers began falling, not through force, but through understanding and opportunity. As the event wound down, Mr. Wilson and Captain Thompson stood by the hangar door, watching planes take off in the distance. You know, Mr. Wilson said, I used to think I was successful because of what I owned. Now I realize true success is about what you change. Captain Thompson nodded. Every flight is a chance to rise above, he replied, watching a plane climb into the evening sky. Behind them, the next class of student pilots practiced their radio calls, their voices carrying the sound of future change. The walls that had seemed so permanent 6 months ago were proving to be as insubstantial as clouds. A news crew captured the final moment of the day, Mr. Wilson and Captain Thompson helping a young student adjust her headset before her first training flight. The camera caught her smile, the encouraging nods from both men, and the simple truth that had emerged from that fateful flight. Sometimes the greatest journeys aren't about reaching a destination, but about changing the hearts that make the journey. As the first stars appeared above the airfield, they twinkled on a new generation of pilots, rising above old prejudices on wings of change.